My name is Alethea Joy. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked as a financial compliance analyst in Toronto. On paper, that sounds stable, predictable, respectable. In real life, it has always made me forgettable. I'm the woman people describe as solid, reliable, practical, the one who remembers birthdays, reads contracts before signing, and double checks the numbers no one else wants to look at. I don't raise my voice. I don't compete for attention. I don't correct people publicly, even when they're wrong. And because of that, I've often been mistaken for smaller than I am. In my family especially, I was cast in a very specific role. The careful one, the cautious one, the one who plays it safe. My younger brother, Adrian, was the opposite. Charismatic, loud, confident in a way that filled rooms. People laughed at his jokes. They admired his ambition. They assumed he would be the one who would make it big. I was the one who rented, for years. And if you've ever rented long enough around people who equate ownership with status, you'll know the tone. The jokes that aren't really jokes. The little comments wrapped in smiles. The implication that you're still waiting for your life to begin. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliation. And it definitely isn't about proving someone wrong in a dramatic, explosive way. It's about something much quieter than that. It's about how repeated small dismissals can slowly teach you what people believe about you. It's about the moment you realize you've been participating in a version of yourself that benefits everyone else. And it's about what happens when you decide, without announcement, without confrontation, to step out of that version. My brother once mocked me for renting. Months later, I became the legal owner of the apartment he was leasing. There were no screaming matches, no triumphant speeches, no public spectacle, just paperwork, timing, and a shift in posture. Ownership changes the tone. But before we get to that moment, you need to understand who I was to them. Because the truth is, none of this started with property. It started with perception. Have you ever noticed how people treat you according to the role they've assigned you, long before you've agreed to it? If you had asked my family to describe me 5 years ago, they would have smiled before answering. Alethea? Oh, she's the responsible one. It sounds like a compliment, and in many ways it was meant to be, but there was always something tucked beneath it. Responsible meant predictable. Predictable meant safe. And safe meant limited. My brother Adrian was the contrast everyone loved to point out. He was bold, spontaneous, the kind of man who talked about big plays and timing the market over Sunday dinner like he was narrating his own highlight reel. He leased a luxury apartment downtown the moment his marketing startup started turning a modest profit. Floor-to-ceiling windows, concierge, underground parking. The kind of building where the lobby smells faintly of eucalyptus and ambition. I rented a one-bedroom in an older brick building 15 minutes away. No concierge, no marble lobby, just clean hallways and a landlord who fixed things without drama. To me, it was practical, affordable, strategic. To them, it was a placeholder. Family gatherings always followed the same rhythm. Adrian would talk about expansion, clients, and networking events on rooftop patios. My parents would nod with visible pride. Someone would eventually turn to me. So, still renting? The tone wasn't cruel, it was curious. But curiosity can carry judgment without raising its voice. Yes, I'd say, and it makes sense for now. That phrase, for now, became my shield. Because what they didn't know was that I had no intention of renting forever. I simply didn't believe in buying to impress. I believed in buying when the numbers made sense. I tracked interest rates the way some people track celebrity news. I studied neighborhood zoning changes. I read condo board financial statements for buildings I didn't even live in. But none of that was visible. Visibility belonged to whoever spoke the loudest. Adrian once laughed during dinner and said, "You know, Elle, at some point you have to stop living like you're in probation." Everyone chuckled, even me. I've always been good at smiling at comments that land heavier than they look. To them, I was cautious to a fault. The woman who overthinks. The sister who waits too long. the quiet one who files her taxes early and declines risky opportunities. They never saw the spreadsheets on my laptop at midnight. The automatic transfers funnel into investment accounts, the way I could recite cap rates from memory for 3 different neighborhoods. Because I never offered that information, part of me didn't want to compete, and part of me had internalized something subtle but powerful. When you are labeled the steady one, you are not expected to transform. So I stayed steady. When Adrian upgraded his car, I congratulated him. When he hosted parties in his leased high-rise, I brought wine. When relatives praised his trajectory, I nodded. There is a particular invisibility that comes not from being ignored, but from being defined too early. I wasn't pitied, I wasn't attacked, I was simply categorized. The reliable daughter, the practical sister, the renter. And when you're placed in a category long enough, people begin speaking to you as if you are a fixed asset, stable, predictable, unlikely to surprise. What no one noticed was that stability, when disciplined, compounds. And I was compounding quietly. I didn't resent Adrian. That's important. I wasn't secretly plotting against him. I loved my brother. I admired his charisma, even when it exhausted me. But there's a difference between loving someone and accepting the narrative they assign you. At the time, though, I hadn't fully recognized that distinction. I simply played my part, the responsible one, the cautious one, the one who rents. And I let them believe that was the full story. The first time it truly stayed with me, it wasn't dramatic. There was no raised voice, no insult sharp enough to defend against. It was a Saturday afternoon in Adrian's building. He had invited the family over to see the view at sunset. He loved that phrase, the view, as if the glass walls themselves were proof of arrival. The lobby gleamed in a way that almost demanded admiration. Polished stone floors, a concierge who greeted him by name. My mother squeezed his arm and whispered, "You've done so well." I smiled. I meant it. Upstairs, the apartment was exactly what you would expect. Minimalist furniture, carefully curated art prints, and a balcony that overlooked the lake like a postcard. My father stepped outside and exhaled loudly, the way men do when they want their approval to feel substantial. Adrian poured drinks. He moved through the space as if he owned it. That detail matters. He didn't own it. He leased it, but he carried himself like the deed was framed somewhere in the hallway. At one point, I wandered into the kitchen and noticed a brochure on the counter. It was from the developer. Floor plans, amenities, projected appreciation. I picked it up, more out of professional curiosity than envy. "Thinking of buying in the building?" I asked casually. Adrian laughed, not harshly, just dismissively. "Please, I'm not tying myself down yet. Leasing gives me flexibility." I nodded. "True, but if the numbers align, locking in early can—" He cut in, grinning. "Al, you don't even own your place." It was said lightly, teasing, performative, but the room heard it. My cousin smirked. My aunt tilted her head slightly, like she was waiting to see how I'd respond. "I know," I said evenly. "I'm just looking at the long-term value." Adrian clinked his glass against mine. "You've been looking long-term for 10 years. Everyone laughed. That was the first small cut. Not because it was cruel, it wasn't, not on the surface. It was the certainty in his tone. The assumption that my pace was equivalent to stagnation, that renting meant hesitation, that caution meant incapacity. And what struck me most was how effortlessly the room accepted that framing. No one asked about my savings, no one asked about my investments, no one asked if perhaps my timeline was deliberate. They simply absorbed his version. Later, as the sun dipped orange behind the skyline, Adrian stood on the balcony and said, "You should move into a place like this. Level up a little." He meant well. That's the complicated part. "Well," I replied, "ownership changes the tone." He laughed again. "Only if you can afford it." It was a joke, but I remember the exact sensation in my chest when he said it. Not anger, not embarrassment. Clarity. Because in that moment, I realized something subtle but undeniable. My brother genuinely believed I couldn't. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. And once you understand what someone believes about your capacity, you begin seeing every comment through that lens. That night, I went home to my older brick building. The hallway lights flickered slightly. The elevator hummed louder than necessary. I unlocked my door and stepped into my small, quiet living room. No skyline, no marble, just stillness. I placed my keys in the same ceramic bowl I've used for years and sat at my dining table. I opened my laptop, not to scroll, not to vent, not to replay the conversation, but to review something I'd already been studying for months. The market, interest rates, inventory. I didn't make a dramatic vow. I didn't whisper, "I'll show him." But I did write one sentence in the notes section of my budgeting app. Never let someone else define your timeline. The first small cut didn't bleed. It just marked the place where perception and reality quietly separated. And once you notice that gap, you can't unsee it. After that afternoon, nothing outwardly changed. No arguments, no cold shoulders. Adrian still sent me memes at midnight. I still helped him review client contracts when he needed a second set of eyes. We were, by all visible measures, close. But something subtle had shifted in me. Once you've heard the assumption, she can't afford it, you start noticing how often it appears in different clothing. It showed up at Thanksgiving. My aunt was discussing property taxes, complaining about how much they'd increased. Adrian leaned back in his chair and said, "That's why I lease. Flexibility, no long-term shackles." Then he glanced at me. "Al prefers to wait until she's absolutely certain, right?" The table turned to me again. I smiled. "I prefer to make informed decisions." "Translation," he said playfully, "analysis paralysis." Laughter. Forks clinking against plates. I laughed too. That's how normalization happens. Not through cruelty, but through repetition wrapped in humor. A narrative told often enough that even the person it's about begins to respond on cue. I told myself it wasn't serious. I told myself he didn't mean anything by it. I told myself that being teased for caution was better than being criticized for recklessness. And in many ways that was true, but what I didn't acknowledge was how often I shrank in those moments. I stopped mentioning market research entirely. I stopped sharing small financial wins. When my investment portfolio crossed a threshold I had quietly set for myself years ago, I celebrated alone, with takeout and a spreadsheet. I rationalized my silence as maturity. Why argue? Why correct? Why compete? But silence, when repeated, can start to resemble agreement. Adrian began offering unsolicited advice. "You should think bigger," he said one evening while we walked to our cars after dinner at our parents' house. "Real estate isn't that complicated. You just have to move." I nodded. "Movement without leverage is just motion." He chuckled. "There you go again." He didn't ask what I meant. That was the pattern. He filled the space confidently. I filled it carefully. And confidence is often mistaken for competence when no one checks the math. There were other small comments. Some people just aren't wired for risk. You're comfortable where you are. You like security. Each one was delivered casually. Each one reinforced the role. And I let it, because confronting it felt unnecessary, petty even. Was I really going to challenge every offhand remark? Demand that people reassess their assumptions? That would require energy, drama, explanation. So I told myself something very reasonable. It doesn't matter what they think. But here's the truth I learned later. It doesn't matter what they think until their thinking begins shaping how they treat you. Adrian started speaking to me differently about money, simplifying explanations, skimming over details as if I wouldn't follow, offering beginner tips I had mastered years earlier. Once he said, "When you're ready to buy, I'll walk you through it." I thanked him. I didn't correct him, because part of me still believed that keeping the peace was more valuable than correcting the narrative. And part of me wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I was too cautious. Maybe I was hiding behind preparation. Maybe I had normalized waiting. That's how repetition works. It doesn't just shape how others see you. It can slowly distort how you see yourself. But there was one thing they didn't know. While they joked about my hesitation, I was tracking one specific building with unusual attention. Adrian's building. I knew the developer's history. I knew the percentage of leased units versus owned. I knew when initial buyers would begin reselling. And I knew something else. Leases expire. Titles transfer. And markets move whether or not you announce your intentions. They thought I was standing still. In reality, I was observing patterns. And observation, when patient, becomes positioning. I didn't confront the disrespect. I studied it. and I began to understand something that would change everything. When people are certain about who you are, they stop watching you closely. That was the first advantage I didn't know I was building. There's a quiet moment in every long-standing dynamic when you realize the role you've been given wasn't accidental. It was convenient. By the time I turned 35, the pattern in my family was fully formed. Adrian was the visionary, the risk taker, the one destined for scale. I was the stabilizer, the contingency plan, the one who read the fine print. At first, that division felt balanced, complementary even, but roles solidify over time. At family dinners, Adrian spoke in projections: growth, expansion, next quarter, next move. I spoke in confirmations. Yes, that's accurate. No, that clause needs revision. Maybe consider the long-term liability. He was potential. I was maintenance. And maintenance, while necessary, rarely receives applause. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was gradual, like sediment layering over the years. When our parents needed help refinancing their mortgage, they called me. When Adrian wanted feedback on a partnership contract, he called me. When relatives debated investment opportunities, they turned to me for clarity, but turned to him for excitement. I was trusted, but not admired. And I hadn't realized how deeply I had internalized that difference until one particular evening. We were celebrating Adrian's company hitting a revenue milestone. The dinner was loud, warm, and full of congratulatory energy. At some point, my mother raised her glass and said, "We always knew you would take big steps." Then she turned to me and added kindly, "And we're grateful Alethea keeps things grounded." Grounded. The word stayed with me long after the plates were cleared. Grounded can mean stable. It can also mean tethered. On the drive home, I replayed the conversation, not with resentment, but with a kind of detached curiosity. What exactly was my function in their narrative? I was the dependable one, the one who would never surprise them, the one who would always be financially fine, the one who would never take a dramatic leap. Reliable, useful, invisible. There's a subtle comfort people feel when they believe someone will remain exactly as they've categorized them. It removes uncertainty, it reduces complexity, it keeps the story neat. And I had made their story easy. I rarely shared my long-term plans. I avoided discussing numbers unless asked directly. I deflected compliments and absorbed jokes. I had mistaken emotional restraint for humility. But humility doesn't require erasure. The deeper realization came when I noticed something else. No one asked about my goals. Not once did anyone say, "What are you building?" or "What do you want?" They assumed my goal was stability. They assumed renting meant waiting. They assumed caution meant fear. And because I never contradicted those assumptions, they hardened into identity. That night, I opened my laptop again. Same dining table, same quiet apartment. I pulled up a spreadsheet I had been refining for months. A comparison of units in Adrian's building that were nearing resale eligibility, developer timelines, owner turnover rates, mortgage projections under different interest scenarios. I wasn't looking at it emotionally. I was studying it like data, and that's when I saw the role more clearly than ever. They expected me to support, not to acquire. They expected me to review contracts, not to sign them. They expected me to applaud milestones, not to create my own. And suddenly the question wasn't whether they underestimated me. It was whether I had been complicit in that underestimation. There is a difference between being underestimated and remaining underpositioned. One is external. The other is a choice. For years, I had allowed the role because it was peaceful, predictable, free of confrontation. But peace without progression eventually becomes stagnation. And for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not envy, discomfort. A quiet, precise awareness that I had outgrown the role they were still applauding me for playing. I closed the laptop and sat back in my chair. The room was silent. No skyline, no marble lobby, no audience. Just me and the recognition that I had been cast as the steady one. And steady, when disciplined, can look exactly like stillness. Right before movement, the shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen at dinner. It didn't even happen because of something Adrian said. It happened on a Tuesday morning, quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable. I was reviewing quarterly compliance reports at work when an alert came through on one of my real estate tracking feeds. A unit in Adrian's building, same layout as his, 2 floors above, had just been listed for sale. I clicked without thinking. The photos loaded slowly. The same open concept kitchen, the same glass balcony railing, the same view stretching toward the lake, different furniture, different lighting, but structurally identical. The price was reasonable, not low, not suspicious, just strategically placed, likely from an early buyer ready to exit with modest profit. I opened my spreadsheet, ran the numbers, adjusted for current rates, stress tested scenarios, and for the first time, the projections didn't feel theoretical. They felt aligned. It wasn't just affordability. I had been financially capable for a while. That wasn't new. What was new was the absence of hesitation. There was no internal debate about whether I was ready, no imagined commentary from family members, no mental rehearsal of explanations, just clarity. I closed the browser tab and stared at my reflection in the dark screen for a moment. All those years of being labeled cautious, had they trained me to delay action beyond necessity, or had they simply sharpened my patience until the timing was exact? At lunch, I walked outside. The air was crisp. Toronto in early spring, still cool but carrying the promise of thaw. I didn't call Adrian. I didn't text anyone. I called a real estate lawyer I had worked with on compliance reviews years earlier, not for advice, for availability. Hypothetically, I asked, if I were to move quickly on a condo purchase in the downtown core, how tight could the timeline be? There was a pause on the other end. How prepared are you? He asked. Very. That was the first moment I heard it in my own voice. Not defensiveness, not urgency, preparedness. The rest of the afternoon passed like any other, meetings, emails, policy reviews, but internally something had settled. For years, I had framed ownership as a milestone to reach. Now I saw it as a lever. Ownership changes the tone, not just externally, but internally. Renting had always made sense strategically. It allowed liquidity, flexibility, investment growth elsewhere. But at some point, flexibility becomes comfort. And comfort, if prolonged, can quietly preserve the roles others assign you. I went home that evening and didn't turn on the television. I sat at my dining table again, but this time I didn't open a research file. I opened my banking dashboard. Liquid assets, investment accounts, emergency reserves, pre-approval range. The numbers were calm, organized, ready, and I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't motivated by proving anyone wrong. I was motivated by alignment. The person I had quietly become no longer matched the role I was publicly playing. There was a misalignment between perception and capacity, and misalignment, left unresolved, erodes self-respect over time. The shift wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional, it was precise. I no longer wanted to be the steady background character in someone else's growth story. I wanted to author my own positioning. That night, before bed, I wrote a single sentence in my notes app. Act when you no longer need permission. No announcement, no declaration, just a decision forming quietly beneath the surface. The next morning, I requested the full listing package for the unit. Not because I was angry, not because I was reactive, but because something had shifted. And once alignment replaces hesitation, movement becomes inevitable. There's a difference between silence that comes from shrinking and silence that comes from strategy. For years, mine had been the first kind. Now it was becoming the second. After requesting the listing package, I didn't change my behavior. I didn't suddenly become distant or intense. If anything, I became more relaxed. That's the irony of preparation. When you know what you're building, you stop needing to defend yourself verbally. Adrian called me that weekend. "You coming to the rooftop mixer on Thursday?" he asked. "A few potential investors will be there. Good networking for you." I smiled even though he couldn't see me. "Networking for me?" "Yeah," he said lightly. "You never know when you'll want to level up." Level up. The phrase that used to irritate me now sounded harmless. "Maybe," I replied. "I'll check my schedule." He didn't hear the shift in my tone. Why would he? It was subtle, calm, unprovocative. While he was planning social moves, I was reviewing reserve fund studies for his building. I was reading condo board meeting minutes. I was studying recent comparable sales in the same stack of units. The numbers told a story louder than any rooftop conversation. And here's what fascinated me. The less I engaged in the teasing, the more it continued. Not aggressively, but predictably. At dinner that week, Adrian joked again about my eternal rental era. I didn't laugh this time. I didn't correct him either. I simply asked, "When does your lease renew?" He blinked slightly. "September, why?" "Just curious." That was it. No edge, no accusation. Just information. Silence, when calm, unsettles more than rebuttal. He studied me for a second, as if trying to detect sarcasm. There was none. So he moved on. What he didn't know was that I had already spoken with a mortgage advisor. I had already stress-tested rates above current levels. I had already calculated carrying costs, including maintenance fees and property taxes, under conservative assumptions. And I had already decided something critical. If I moved forward, I would not tell him. Not because I wanted to surprise him, but because I no longer felt obligated to narrate my growth. There's a subtle dependency in families where roles are fixed. We inform each other of moves not just out of transparency, but out of habit, out of unconscious permission seeking. This time I wanted no commentary. I wanted clean execution. The more I prepared, the quieter I became. Not withdrawn, not cold, just self-contained. Adrian mistook it for passivity. At one point he said, "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said, "just focused." He nodded approvingly, as if focus were a temporary state for me, like I was studying for an exam I might or might not pass. He still believed the narrative, that I was careful, slow, hesitant. He didn't see that caution, when matured, becomes precision. And precision rarely announces itself before it acts. The listing agent emailed me additional financial disclosures midweek. I reviewed them at my dining table, highlighter in hand. No rush, no adrenaline, no. Just analysis. I wasn't reacting to disrespect anymore. I was positioned beyond it. That distinction changed everything. Silence was no longer a shield. It was a boundary. I stopped volunteering my thoughts about his building. I stopped correcting his assumptions about the market. I stopped offering small pieces of insight that might sharpen his strategy. Not out of spite, out of recalibration. If they saw me as background stability, then background I would be, until the foreground shifted on its own. And in the quiet of my apartment, beneath flickering hallway lights and humming elevators, I realized something almost ironic. The woman they thought was standing still had already started moving. They just couldn't hear it. Preparation rarely looks impressive from the outside. It looks like routine. It looks like someone is going home early instead of attending another rooftop event. It looks like declining a second glass of wine. It looks like spreadsheets instead of selfies. No one applauds preparation because no one sees it. And that became my quiet advantage. While Adrian expanded his social calendar, I narrowed my focus. I requested status certificates for 3 different units in his building, not just the one I initially saw. I wanted a comparison. Leverage doesn't come from wanting one option. It comes from understanding multiple. I studied the condo board's financial health, reserve fund adequacy, upcoming capital expenditures, elevator maintenance schedules, even litigation history. I wasn't just buying square footage. I was evaluating governance. Most people, when leasing, never look that closely. They trust the aesthetic, the lobby, the concierge greeting. Ownership demands deeper scrutiny. Ownership changes the tone. At work, I found myself sharper, more decisive. It was as if having a private objective clarified everything else. I negotiated deadlines more firmly. I declined unnecessary meetings. I conserved energy. Adrian noticed the productivity, but not the reason. "You've been intense lately," he said during a phone call about one of his contracts. "Planning to finally buy a place?" He laughed after saying it, clearly not expecting a yes. "Something like that," I replied. He didn't ask further. That's the thing about being underestimated. People stop interrogating your ambiguity. They assume it's harmless. What he didn't know was that I had already toured 2 units, quietly, midweek, during my lunch breaks. I wore my usual charcoal blazer, carried my black leather portfolio, asked precise questions about soundproofing, HVAC servicing, and pet policies. The agents treated me differently from how they treated younger buyers. I wasn't dazzled. I wasn't emotional. I requested documents before discussing decor. One of them said, "You seem very prepared." I smiled. I like clarity. At night, back in my rented apartment, I documented everything: comparative pricing trends, days on market averages for that specific building, negotiation patterns for similar layouts. I noticed something interesting. Units directly above and below Adrian's stack were beginning to turn over. Early investors were exiting, and the price curve was stabilizing, neither inflated nor distressed. It was the kind of window that doesn't scream opportunity, it whispers it. And because I wasn't emotionally attached to proving anything, I could hear the whisper clearly. There was one more layer they never noticed. I reduced visible spending, not dramatically, just subtly. Fewer dinners out, fewer impulse purchases. I redirected discretionary income toward liquidity, not because I lacked funds, but because I wanted optionality. Leverage feels different when it's not tight. I also reviewed Adrian's lease timeline carefully. September renewal. That meant if I moved quickly, closing within 60 to 90 days, ownership would transfer well before his lease expired. Timing isn't dramatic, it's structural. At a family brunch, my cousin asked Adrian if he was thinking of buying soon. "Maybe next year," he said confidently. "I just need to decide if I want to stay in the city core." Then he glanced at me again. "Ale's still researching. She'll buy when she's 80. Laughter. I took a sip of coffee. Didn't respond. What would I have said? That I had already spoken to a lender? That I had pre-negotiated legal fees? Was I reviewing purchase agreements line by line at midnight? There's something almost protective about letting people underestimate you while you prepare. They relax around you. They don't guard information. They don't compete. Adrian once forwarded me a PDF of the building's amenity upgrades, proud of the improvements management had planned. He had no idea I had already reviewed the capital allocation breakdown and calculated its impact on future maintenance fees. What they never noticed was that I wasn't preparing emotionally. I wasn't fantasizing about a reveal. I was positioning for permanence, and permanence, unlike performance, doesn't need an audience. By the time the third unit I was tracking reduced its price slightly after 3 weeks on the market, I felt something settle inside me. Not excitement, certainty. Preparation had shifted from possibility to readiness. They still saw me as the steady renter. But beneath that label, a different version of me had already signed off internally on something irreversible. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was aligning action with capacity. And alignment, once achieved, moves quietly. But it moves decisively. The private reveal didn't happen in a dramatic office with panoramic views. It happened at my dining table. Same chair, same ceramic bowl holding my keys. Same faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen. But this time I wasn't analyzing. I was deciding. The third unit I had been tracking, the one 2 floors above Adrian's, had adjusted its price again. Not a drastic drop, just enough to signal motivation. The seller had owned it since pre-construction. Their equity cushion was comfortable. They weren't desperate. They were ready. I opened my spreadsheet and ran the numbers one final time. Purchase price. Closing costs, land transfer tax, maintenance fees, conservative appreciation scenarios, worst-case rental comparables if I ever needed to lease it out. I stress-tested everything. Even under pessimistic assumptions, the unit aligned with my long-term strategy. It wouldn't stretch me. It wouldn't compromise liquidity. It wouldn't disrupt my broader investment allocation. It made sense. Not emotionally. Structurally, that distinction was important because this wasn't about buying my brother's view. It was about acquiring an asset in a building whose financial health I understood better than most residents. Ownership changes the tone, but before it changes anyone else's tone, it changes yours. I stared at the ceiling for a long time that night, not imagining the balcony or the skyline, but imagining the paperwork complete, the title registered. My name is attached to the unit number. There was no surge of adrenaline, just a quiet internal recalibration. For years, I had framed my identity around being careful, prepared, deliberate, and I was all those things. But preparation without execution eventually becomes avoidance. And I realized something simple. I no longer needed more data. I needed movement. The next morning, I called the agent. "I'd like to submit an offer," I said. There was a pause. Brief professional surprise. Are you comfortable with the list price? She asked. No, I replied calmly. I'd like to propose something slightly below, conditional on status review. We discussed terms, deposit structure, closing timeline, 60 days. That number mattered. 60 days placed closing comfortably before Adrian's lease renewal window. Again, not for drama. For alignment. When I hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. Grounded in a way that was different from the role my family had assigned me. This grounding wasn't about being safe. It was about being positioned. I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents. Not my closest friend. Not even the colleague who had once helped me review condo disclosures. This decision felt private, sacred almost, because it wasn't reactive. It wasn't fueled by irritation or ego. It was a quiet correction of misalignment. That evening, Adrian texted me a photo of the sunset from his balcony. You're missing out, he wrote. I looked at the photo carefully. The angle, the stack, the neighboring building reflections. Then I replied, it's a good view. That was all. He had no idea that above him, 2 floors higher, an offer with my name on it was moving through negotiations. He didn't know that the building he occupied as a tenant was, on paper, about to include me as an owner. And that was the private reveal. Not a speech, not a confrontation, just the awareness that I had crossed a threshold internally long before anyone else would notice externally. The seller countered the next day. I reviewed, adjusted slightly, accepted. Conditional period, 10 business days. During those 10 days, I felt the quietest I had ever felt. Not anxious, not restless, certain. When the status certificate came back clean, reserve fund healthy, no pending litigation, no special assessments forecasted, I signed the waiver. Firm, binding, irreversible. I closed my laptop and placed my hands flat on the table. The room looked exactly the same as it had for years, but I didn't. The private reveal wasn't something I would announce. It was something I carried. A shift from potential to ownership, from observation to action. From the renter, they joked about. To the owner, it never saw coming. Once the offer went firm, the story could have unfolded in several different directions. That's the part people rarely talk about. The moment after commitment, but before exposure. I had options. I could tell Adrian immediately. Frame it as a shared win. Let him be surprised in a light, celebratory way. Turn it into a bonding moment. I could wait until closing and casually mention it at dinner. Drop it into conversation like an afterthought. Or I could say nothing at all until the structure itself required acknowledgement. Each option carried a different tone. And tone was everything. Ownership changes the tone, but how you reveal ownership determines who controls it. For a few days, I observed my own impulses carefully. Was there any part of me that wanted the reveal to feel dramatic? To watch his expression shift? To correct the narrative in one clean sentence? If I'm honest, a small part of me was curious. Not vengeful, just curious. What would happen if the steady, cautious renter quietly appeared on the title registry of the building he had used as a symbol of his upward trajectory? But curiosity is not a strategy. And I had learned slowly that reacting to emotion, positive or negative, creates unnecessary friction. So I stepped back. The real decision point wasn't whether to tell him. It was whether this purchase was about him at all. I sat at my dining table again, closing documents printed neatly in my black leather portfolio. I traced my name on the purchase agreement. Alethea Joy Bennett, purchaser. I asked myself one direct question. If Adrian had never teased me, would I still buy this unit? The answer came quickly. Yes. That clarity changed everything. Because if the purchase was aligned independent of him, then the reveal didn't need to be orchestrated around him. This wasn't a countermove. It was a personal progression. And once I saw that, the decision became simple. I would proceed as if he were irrelevant to the timeline. No announcement, no secrecy fueled by suspense, just discretion. When he called me that week to complain about a minor issue in his unit, something about HVAC airflow, I listened carefully. You should talk to property management, I suggested. I did, he sighed. They said it's standard. Honestly, leasing has its downsides. I paused. Every structure has trade-offs, I said. He laughed lightly, spoken like someone who doesn't have to deal with ownership headaches. I let the silence sit for half a second longer than usual. Then I replied evenly, Headaches are manageable when you understand the structure. He didn't catch it. Why would he? From his perspective, nothing had changed. I was still the cautious one, still renting, still observing, but internally I had crossed into a different category. The decision point wasn't about property. It was about posture. For years, I had responded to the role assigned to me. Now I was acting from my own alignment. That subtle shift removed any desire for spectacle. There would be no grand reveal, just timing. Closing was scheduled for mid-July, 60 days. Between now and then, nothing in my external behavior needed to change, and that was the quietest power of all. I would attend dinners, answer calls, review contracts when asked, all while knowing that 2 floors above Adrian's leased apartment, a deed was being prepared with my name on it. Irreversible doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like paperwork filed calmly. The decision was made, not about whether to buy, but about how to carry it, silently. Closing processes are rarely cinematic. They are procedural, structured, quietly meticulous, which suited me perfectly. Once the agreement was firm, everything shifted into documentation. Wire instructions, title searches, insurance confirmations, mortgage finalization. Every step required signatures, verification, and precision. I didn't rush any of it. Speed impresses people. Accuracy protects you. My lawyer sent draft documents in controlled batches. I reviewed every clause before signing, even the standard ones. Not because I distrusted the process, but because I respected it. Ownership is not a vibe, it's a liability, and I wanted no surprises attached to my name. The lender's appraisal came back aligned with the purchase price. No issues. The building's reserve fund study confirmed adequate capital planning for the next 5 years. No looming special assessments. Everything was structurally sound. That detail mattered more to me than any sunset view. Adrian, meanwhile, was busy. His company had secured a new client. He was traveling more, posting photos from conferences, talking about scaling operations. The rooftop mixers continued. He mentioned casually one evening that he might renew his lease for another year. "It's just easier," he said. "I don't feel like dealing with ownership paperwork yet." I nodded. Convenience has value. He didn't notice the faint shift in emphasis. While he was avoiding paperwork, I was finalizing mine. The deposit was transferred first. A clean wire. Confirm receipt. I felt nothing dramatic when the funds left my account. No anxiety, no regret. Just a recalibration of balance sheets. Then came insurance. Utilities setup. Property tax account registration. Small details most people consider tedious. I found them grounding. Each administrative task made the ownership more tangible, not emotionally, but structurally. I requested building access cards to be prepared for closing day. The property management office didn't question it. My name would soon appear in their system as a unit owner. That thought lingered quietly. No one else knew. At dinner one Sunday, Adrian joked again. "You know, Ale, you should just move into my building. The appreciation alone would make you feel grown up." I looked at him evenly. "I've considered it." He laughed. "Sure you have." There was no sting in his voice this time, just familiarity, the repetition of an old dynamic. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to defend or shrink. Because defense implies vulnerability. And I wasn't vulnerable anymore. I was positioned. Closing day arrived on a Wednesday. I took a half day off work, wore my charcoal blazer, carried my black leather portfolio, the same one I'd brought to countless meetings where I had reviewed contracts for other people's assets. This time the asset was mine. The lawyer walked me through the final signatures. Mortgage registration, title transfer, funds disbursement. Then he slid one final document across the table. "Congratulations," he said. "You're now the registered owner." The sentence landed softly. No applause, no dramatic soundtrack, just ink drying on paper. Ownership changes the tone, not because others suddenly respect you, but because you no longer require their perception to validate your capacity. When I stepped out of the office, the city looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Traffic moved, streetcars rattled, people rushed past with coffee cups. Nothing had shifted externally, but internally something irreversible had settled. 2 floors above my brother's leased apartment, a unit now legally belongs to me. He was still a tenant. I was now an owner, and he had no idea. The first consequence wasn't loud. It was logistical. About 2 weeks after closing, the building management sent out a standard notice to residents: updated ownership registry, minor amenity scheduling changes, and a reminder about balcony maintenance guidelines. It was routine, except this time my name was on the internal ownership list. Adrian mentioned the email casually when he called me that evening. "Management's been sending more notices lately," he said. "New owners moving in, I think." I listened quietly. "Turnover happens," I replied. "Yeah," he said. "Probably investors cashing out. Smart move if the market plateaus." There was something almost ironic in his tone, analyzing ownership shifts from the position of a tenant. I didn't correct him. Consequences don't need commentary. They unfold. A few days later, I visited the building in the early evening, not to see Adrian, but to meet a contractor for a minor paint refresh in my unit. Nothing dramatic, just neutral tones, clean lines. When I walked through the lobby, the concierge greeted me politely, but without recognition. "Unit number?" he asked. I gave it. He checked his screen. Then he looked up, slightly adjusting his posture. "Welcome, Ms. Bennett." That was the first external shift. Subtle, respectful, procedural, but different. Ownership changes the tone, even in how strangers address you. Upstairs, the unit was quiet, empty, waiting. I stood by the balcony doors and looked down. 2 floors below, Adrian's balcony furniture was visible. Same layout, same angle, same skyline. But perspective felt altered, not elevated in ego, elevated in structure. Over the next week, small ripples began appearing. Adrian mentioned that maintenance fees in the building were scheduled to increase slightly next year. "Doesn't affect me much," he said. "Landlord's issue." I asked evenly, "Do you know how much?" He shrugged. "A couple of hundred, I think." I did know how much, because I had reviewed the board's budget forecast line by line before purchasing. The increase was modest and strategically planned to strengthen the reserve fund. Not a problem. A sign of responsible governance. But Adrian's casual detachment from it revealed something deeper. He experienced the building as a lifestyle. I experienced it as an asset. Another consequence appeared when he began casually discussing lease renewal. "Landlord wants a small rent increase," he said one night. "Nothing crazy, just market adjustment." I kept my voice steady. "That's typical if demand's steady." "Yeah," he sighed. Still annoying. Annoyance. That was new. Not frustration directed at me, just a subtle discomfort emerging from his own structure. He had always spoken about the building with pride, as if proximity to ownership was enough. But now, without realizing it, he was feeling the limits of leasing. And I was feeling the weight of the title. Different pressures. Different positions. I didn't intervene. Didn't advise. Didn't offer insights about market leverage or negotiation strategy. For years, I had supported. Now I observed. At a family dinner, my aunt mentioned rising property values downtown. "Adrian's building must be appreciating nicely," she said. He nodded confidently. "Yeah, it's a solid place." Then she turned to me. "Still renting, Alethea?" The old question. The familiar tone. I paused just long enough to feel the shift inside me. "Yes," I said calmly. "I've made some adjustments recently." It wasn't a lie. It wasn't a reveal. It was a bridge. Because consequences don't begin with confrontation. They begin with subtle misalignment between assumption and reality. And that misalignment was widening. He was negotiating rent increases. I was reviewing asset appreciation. He was discussing lease terms. I was approving paint samples. No one had noticed yet, but structures were shifting. And structures, once altered, inevitably change behavior. The tone of future conversations was already adjusting. Even if they didn't know why, the shift became visible in September. That was when Adrian's lease renewal deadline approached. For weeks, he had been casually dismissive about it. "I'll probably just sign another year," he said one evening. "The market's weird right now. Buying doesn't make sense." He said it confidently, like a strategist delaying entry for optimal timing. But confidence, when repeated without recalibration, starts to sound like justification. A few days later, he called me, later than usual. "You know what's frustrating?" he began. "My landlord raised the rent more than I expected." "How much?" I asked. He told me. It wasn't unreasonable by market standards, but it was enough to unsettle him. "I mean," he continued, "if I'm going to pay that much, I might as well build equity." There it was. The sentence he had once used as a punchline against me. I listened quietly. "Have you considered buying?" I asked evenly. He exhaled. "I don't know. Inventory's tight, and honestly, I didn't plan for this. I'd need time. Time. The one thing leverage quietly consumes. Over the next week, I watched something I hadn't anticipated, not regret toward me, but discomfort within him. He began researching listings more seriously, asking about down payments, talking about interest rates as they had personally offended him. At dinner, he was quieter, not defeated, just recalculating. And here's the important part. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt, sober. Because once structures are in place, emotion becomes irrelevant. One afternoon, he called again. I toured a unit in my building, he said. Same layout. They're asking more than I expected. Is it worth it? I asked. He hesitated. I don't know. I should have looked into this earlier. Should have. That word carries weight. But ownership windows don't reopen because someone wishes they had acted sooner. Markets move. Sellers exit. Opportunities rotate. And preparation determines who steps in when alignment appears. He didn't know that one of the units he had recently admired online, the one with the slightly better balcony angle, was mine. He didn't know that the tight inventory he was complaining about had already included me. By the time he realized how quickly units in his stack were selling, the pricing had adjusted upward again. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to change calculations. One evening, he came over to my apartment. My rented apartment, as far as he knew. We sat at my small dining table. I think I missed the window, he admitted quietly. I didn't rush to fill the silence. What window? I asked gently. To buy in my building at a reasonable price, he said. I assumed I had more time. Assumptions are expensive. I nodded. Timing matters. He looked at me differently for a moment. Not dismissively. Not teasing. Just uncertain. Do you ever worry about waiting too long? He asked. I held his gaze calmly. No, I said. I worry about moving without preparation. He leaned back, absorbing that. The thing about irreversible decisions is that they don't announce themselves loudly. They just remove certain options from the table. By the time Adrian felt the urgency, I had already moved through it months earlier. By the time he started calculating leverage, mine was already registered on title. Too late to fix it doesn't always mean catastrophic loss. Sometimes it just means someone else aligned before you did. An alignment, once executed, cannot be undone. He renewed his lease. 1 more year. Temporary. Adjustable. Reversible. 2 floors above him, my unit sat freshly painted. Permanent. Registered. Irreversible. And he still didn't know. The confrontation wasn't scheduled. It happened by accident. Or maybe inevitability just looks like an accident when it finally surfaces. I had planned to move into the unit gradually. Not dramatically. A few pieces of furniture at a time, quiet transfers, administrative updates, no social announcement. But buildings are ecosystems. Information circulates. One Saturday morning, I was in the lobby speaking with property management about a minor locker access issue. I was dressed casually, black trousers, soft sweater, hair pulled back, no portfolio, no blazer, just me. Adrian walked in mid-conversation. He stopped. Not dramatically, not loudly. Just stopped. He looked from me to the property manager. Unit 2408's locker key should have been programmed yesterday, I was saying calmly. The manager nodded. Yes, Ms. Bennett. We'll correct that immediately. Adrian blinked. Ms. Bennett? He repeated lightly. I turned. Our eyes met. There was no audience, just the concierge behind the desk pretending not to listen. Hi, I said gently. What are you doing here? He asked. Handling something upstairs. He glanced at the manager's screen, then back at me. Upstairs where? 2 floors above you, I replied. The words weren't sharp. They were factual. He stared at me for a moment, processing. Wait, he said quietly. You what? What? I purchased a unit, I said evenly. It closed in July. There was no flourish, no dramatic pause, just information. He exhaled slowly, almost as if recalibrating his understanding of gravity. You bought here? He asked. Yes. Since when were you looking? For a while. There it was. The gap between perception and reality compressing into a single, silent realization. He wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. He was disoriented. Not because I had succeeded, but because he hadn't seen it coming. You didn't tell me, he said finally. I didn't think I needed to, I replied gently. That sentence carried no accusation, just autonomy. We moved to the side of the lobby to avoid blocking foot traffic. His posture had changed, not smaller, not diminished, but recalibrated. I thought you were still renting, he said. I was, I answered, until I wasn't. Silence. No one raised their voice. No one referenced past jokes, but they hovered between us, those rooftop comments, those dinner table laughs. He rubbed the back of his neck. Is it the same layout as mine? He asked. Yes. Why didn't you say anything? I considered that. Because it wasn't about you, I said calmly. That was the cleanest truth I could offer. He searched my face for sarcasm. There was none. He paused. I didn't think you were ready. I held his gaze, not confrontationally, but steadily. I was. Another silence, not tense, just reorganizing. Ownership changes the tone. And in that moment, the tone between us shifted, not toward rivalry, not toward apology, but toward recognition. He wasn't mocking. I wasn't defending. We were standing in a lobby where the structure itself had rearranged our dynamic. Two brothers can compete loudly. A sister can correct quietly. But what recalibrates respect isn't volume. It's action aligned with capacity. He nodded slowly. Well, he said, almost half smiling, congratulations. Thank you, I replied. No triumph, no humiliation, just a shift in footing. As we walked toward the elevators, he pressed his floor button. I pressed mine, 2 numbers higher. The doors closed between us, and for the first time in years, there was no joke about leveling up. Moving in didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt quiet. The first night I slept in the unit, the city hummed the same way it always had. Streetcars in the distance, wind against the glass. A faint elevator chimed down the hall. But the space felt different, not because of the view, but because of the footing. There's something subtle about unlocking a door you own. Not rent, not borrowed time, owned. Ownership changes the tone. Not in how loudly you speak, but in how little you need to. Adrian and I adjusted gradually. He stopped joking about renting, stopped offering unsolicited advice about leveling up. When we talked about the building, the conversation shifted toward neutral topics, amenities, neighborhood changes, property management updates. There was no formal apology. There didn't need to be. Respect, when recalibrated, doesn't require confession. It requires consistency. I noticed the difference in small ways. He began asking questions instead of assuming answers. What made you choose that timing? He asked one evening while we stood on my balcony. The numbers aligned, I said. He nodded thoughtfully. No laughter, no dismissal, just acknowledgement. For years I had mistaken being underestimated for being unseen. But they're not the same. Being underestimated is external. Being unseen is internal. And I had been seeing myself clearly all along. I just hadn't acted in alignment with that clarity until I was ready. The biggest change wasn't in my brother. It was in me. I no longer felt the need to shrink for harmony. I no longer laughed reflexively at comments that landed heavy. I no longer carried the quiet tension of proving something, because there was nothing left to prove. The role they assigned me, steady, cautious, grounded, wasn't wrong. It was incomplete. Steady doesn't mean stagnant. Cautious doesn't mean incapable. Grounded doesn't mean tethered. It means disciplined. And discipline, when paired with timing, becomes leverage. Sometimes I still visit my old rental building. I walk past it occasionally on purpose, not out of nostalgia, but out of gratitude. That small brick apartment held the years of preparation no one saw. The spreadsheets, the late-night calculations, the quiet restraint. It was never a symbol of limitation. It was a launch pad. Adrian's lease will expire again next year. He may buy, he may not. But whatever he chooses, it will be from a different place now. And so will I. Because I am no longer reacting to perception. I am operating from alignment. And alignment is silent. It doesn't argue. It doesn't boast. It simply stands, 2 floors above what I used to be. Not elevated in ego, just elevated in structure. When people hear this story, they often expect a sharper ending, a dramatic speech in the lobby, a public apology at dinner, a moment where someone says, "I was wrong about you." That didn't happen, and I'm grateful it didn't. Because this was never about humiliating my brother. It was about correcting my own alignment. For years, I allowed myself to be defined by a role that was convenient for everyone else. The steady one, the cautious one, the renter. I wore those labels without protest because they were easier than explaining the full picture. But here's what I've learned. If you don't actively define yourself through action, people will define you through assumption. And assumptions, repeated long enough, begin to feel like truth. My brother mocked me for renting, lightly, casually, repeatedly. I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. I didn't announce my plans. I prepared. And when the numbers aligned, I acted. Ownership changes the tone. Not because it makes you superior, but because it makes you responsible. Responsible for your decisions. Responsible for your timing. Responsible for the posture you carry into every room. The real shift wasn't the deed. It was the moment I stopped needing external validation before moving forward. We talk a lot about proving people wrong, but sometimes the quietest dominance isn't about proving anything at all. It's about building something so solid that commentary becomes irrelevant. Today, Adrian and I stand on different floors of the same building, not in competition, not in resentment, just in different structures. And that difference wasn't created by confrontation, it was created by preparation. So let me ask you something gently. Have you been living inside a role that no longer fits you, simply because it's the one others expect? If so, what would alignment look like for you? I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments.